Hi and welcome back to the channel. This is the 7th of my January videos where I look at movies that I haven't seen before. Tomorrow when this video comes out is the 26th of January here, which some people call Australia Day and other people call Invasion Day. It's the day that the first fleet arrived in Sydney Harbour and started the white colonisation of Australia. And it's a very difficult holiday for a lot of us. Some people see it as a day to honour, and it's a day about white people in Australia, and it's a day about Australia in general. But for many of us, it's called Invasion Day, and it's about it's a sad day, and it's a day that we want the public holiday shifted from, so it's not on the anniversary of an event which had a genocidal effect on Indigenous Australians. So it's a very tough day. There's a lot of crap being told about the 26th of January in a lot of our media, including that it's always been on the 26th of January, so we can't change the day. It was only ever changed to a public holiday, and it's the 26th of January all across Australia in 1988. And I know because on that day, when a lot of Australia was celebrating the bicentennial of the colonisation of Australia, and there was a lot of fireworks and parades and speeches and all sorts of other things going on for the whole year.
Celebration of the nation. Give us a hand. Celebration of the nation. Let's make it grand. Let's lend a hand and show the world how brave we ought to be.
And I lived in Sydney at the time, and there were fireworks going off every 2 weeks that year. I didn't do that. I went to an Indigenous protest march in Sydney where 100,000 people decided that we had a different view about the history of Australia. It was a really interesting day for me. It was a very eye-opening day, and it's a day that's really made me an ally to the cause of Indigenous Australians. And they came from all over Australia. Some of them drove for a week to get to this protest in the middle of summer. Originally, the white people supporting the Indigenous march, we were going to march after them in support of them. But we were standing at the side waiting for the Indigenous groups to march from Central Station up to Hyde Park. And all of a sudden, all of these Aboriginal women grabbed us by the arm and pulled us into their mob and said, "You're marching with my mob." And so we marched all together, black people and white people, supporting the rights of Indigenous Australians. And it's one of the most profoundly touching moments of my life where, after everything that's happened, the people whom we were supporting were generous enough to let us be a part of what they were doing. And it really touched me in an incredible way. It's hard to describe, but it showed me that Indigenous Australians are an extraordinary people. They're the longest continuing culture on the planet, and we need to do better by them. So for the 26th, in this January that I'm doing only movies I haven't seen before, I was determined I was going to do a movie with an Indigenous theme. In fact, I was looking at 3 movies. But after I watched this first movie, I decided there was enough there for me to use this to mark this day, however people perceive it, as an important day, and to honour people whom I respect and who deserve the respect of Australia. And unfortunately, due to various governments that we have at the moment, they're simply not getting that now. I'm sorry I got political, but it's context for this movie. And the movie is directed by Phil Noyce, an Australian white director, and it's called Rabbit Proof Fence from 2002. It's a true story from the 1930s of 3 small Aboriginal girls who were taken away from their family because they were half white. And the West Australian government and the Australian government at the time had a policy of integration, basically trying to get Indigenous people to intermarry with white people, or at least interbreed with white people, so that their Aboriginality would go away. And that's explicitly stated in the movie. So these 3 small girls, Molly, Gracie and Daisy, are taken away from Jingalong, the place in the centre of Western Australia where their family are. Their mother lives there, their whole mob live there, And it's along the rabbit-proof fence, which is a fence that went south to north across Australia to keep rabbits away from all of the crops in Western Australia, because rabbits were basically a pest. They were an introduced species that was introduced in Geelong in the 1800s, so somebody would have something to hunt. And they raced across Australia and did enormous ecological damage, and they built a fence from south to north across the country to keep the rabbits out. And Jigalong was one of the places where the people who mended and tended the fences lived. So the three girls are taken away to a place outside, a couple of hundred kilometres outside Perth, called the Moore River Station, where they were basically incarcerated and taught white ways. They weren't allowed to use their own language. They weren't allowed to see family or friends. They were basically imprisoned there until they could be farmed off to white families or made servants to white families. There was a process where they looked at the skin of the children, and the ones who had pale skin got better education, got taken away elsewhere. And it was all run by a man called A.O. Neville, who was known in Indigenous communities as Mr. Devil. He's played in the movie by Kenneth Branagh. And he is monstrous. He's a bureaucrat. He's one of the most evil real-life characters in Australian cinema. And this, by the way, is a true story. It's not made up at all. It was based on a novel. It was written by one of the daughters of these four girls, a woman called Doris Pilkington Garimara. And Doris didn't know about any of this until she talked to her auntie, Daisy, who told her the story of what happened when the girls were in the camp. And what they did was the three of them escaped. Two of them were sisters. One of them was a cousin. They escaped from this camp and travelled 1,500 miles back to Jigalong by themselves, across deserts, across some very harsh landscapes, and they were tracked as well. In the movie, there's a tracker whose job at the camp is to track runaways, and his name's Mudu, and he's played by the recently deceased David Gulpilil, also known as Gulpilil, and he is fantastic in this film. He has a kind of regal stillness about him. He moves beautifully because he was a dancer as well. And even though he doesn't have much dialogue, it's really clear how this guy is thinking all the way through the movie. And he tracks him across thousands of kilometres of Australian desert. Now, the three girls are played by, at that time, non-professional actors. Evelyn Sampe plays Molly, Tiana Sainsbury plays Daisy, and Laura Monahan plays Gracie. And they are excellent. They had a drama coach, Rachel Mazza, who's an Indigenous woman who's also a very fine filmmaker in her own right. And there were enormous complexities to filming this movie, in that it's a story told about Western Australia, but they filmed it around the Flinders Ranges in South Australia, about 1,500, 2,000 kilometres east. And they had to get permission from the Indigenous owners of the Flinders Ranges area to tell a story about the West Australian mob on their land. So there was a lot of cultural negotiation, cultural sensitivity in this movie. And it shows, even though the director was a white Australian man who was very well known for movies like Clear and Present Danger, and he did The Saint with Val Kilmer. Phil Noyce was known as a well-known director, but a lot of the support team and a lot of the other crew were Indigenous people, and that shows in the movie. It's got a sensitivity that's really rare for 2002 in Australian cinema. And so these three little girls had to cross a hostile landscape for a start, and they had bushcraft. They'd been taught by their mob how to survive in the bush, but they didn't know where they were. They knew that they had to go east, so they went east until somebody told them the rabbit-proof fence was there. And once they knew where the fence was, they knew they had to go north in order to get back to Jigalong, where their mob was. And so they travel across the land. Some people help them, some people hinder them. There's some really great scenes with a woman who's a servant on a farm, an Indigenous woman called Mavis, played by the great Deborah Mailman, who gives them shelter for a little bit. And there are some things to do with Mavis's life and Mavis's conditions which are very hard to watch and very kind of punishing in a way. It's not an easy movie to watch in any way. And so the three girls travel across some salt plains and deserts, across creeks and rivers, all the while being tracked not only by Moodoo, but also by the West Australian police, who had a limited budget to do this, but still did put some resources into tracking down these three little girls. The cousin Gracie is kind of tricked into being captured and is captured at some stage. Meanwhile, Molly and Daisy continue on with the trek and eventually get back to Geelong. So, secret to say that because it's fairly implicit in the movie. And I cried at the end of the movie, to be honest with you. It's the first time I've seen it. I knew about the movie, but I hadn't seen it. And I had tears in my eyes at the end of the movie. Molly's first words to her mother and her grandmother when she arrives back at Geelong are heartbreaking. It's an incredible piece of cinema, an incredible piece of Australian cinema as well. Philip Noyce directed the two best movies about Australia and about Australians that I know of. He directed Newsfront in 1978. He directed Rubber Proof Fence in 2002. Now, 20 years on, if this movie was made now, of course it would be made by Indigenous filmmakers. And it's people like Phil Noyce and Rolf de Heer who trained and encouraged Indigenous filmmakers to make movies about their own stories. They were allies and they worked towards giving us an incredibly diverse cinema, which we have now. It's not doing superhero movies, it's not doing enormous blockbusters. But there are smaller Australian cinema projects now with diverse voices, which are putting out some incredible stuff. And Rubber Proof Fence for me is a hard watch. And I'll tell you why. It's a little bit unusual. I don't want to make this at all about me. But the reason why I found it so intensely moving is when I was 7, my father got custody of my brother and myself and took us away from our mother, our sister, our grandparents, our uncles, aunts, everybody, and took us off to a farm outside Sydney, where he actively hid us from my mother and my family for about a dozen years. And that parallels the experience of many Indigenous people in what we now call the stolen generations. Between 1905 and 1967, Indigenous children were taken away from their families and taken away from their cultures and westernised and kind of Britishized and Australianised in white Australian form for a long time. And those people were my age. The youngest of them was younger than I am. And I went to school with members of the stolen generation who were moved into the areas where I lived, in the urban areas. And they were as traumatised in their way as I was in mine. I grew up partly around Redfern, which is an Indigenous area in the Sydney. And I saw a lot of Indigenous people there as well, so it's not like a lot of white Australians at the time were saying, I'd never met an Aboriginal person. I met many Aboriginal people. I holidayed when my father got custody in the central parts of New South Wales, and I saw what racism is. A movie taught me what racism is in the centre of New South Wales. I've got immense empathy for the stolen generations, and Rubber Proof Fence gutted me when I watched it, but I'm incredibly glad that I did. I think it's an important piece of cinema. I think it's an incredibly crucial piece of Australian cinema. It's truth-telling that Australia needs. And it ends on such a wonderful note where there's actually film footage, which they filmed at the time they started the movie, of Doris and Daisy in 2002 when they were very old women walking together through the desert. And that broke my heart. They talked about what happened after the story in the movie ends, and that, I don't have the words to express it. You've got to see the movie, you've got to experience it. It's an incredibly important piece of Australian cinema, and it seemed only right that I do it for this day. I'm sorry if this video is very different than the ones I usually do, but sometimes you've got to do what's important to you. And for me, watching Rubber Proof Fence and talking about it and putting the video out on this very important day in the narrative of Australia, I think is something that I just had to do. So anyway, thank you very much for watching. And again, if it wasn't something that's to your liking, I apologise. I'll be back with lighter stuff and a lot more explosive and kind of exploitative stuff as well in the future. But this one I had to do. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking, subscribing and leaving a comment. You can also support the channel at patreon.com/paleocinema. Look after yourselves. Stay safe out there. Watch some good movies. Watch some bad movies. Watch some movies that make you cry. And I'll catch you next time.